Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Healing and Growing Hand in Hand. I am your host, Lisa Tickle. My guest today is Dr. Mark McNear. He is a psychotherapist. I want to get that right, psychotherapist, a licensed psychotherapist, I should say. And you are also a childhood abuse survivor. And you are the author of, let's see if I can get that in the picture there, is Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And I'll have Dr. McNear's bio in the below. So welcome. And thank you for agreeing to be on my podcast and share your story.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate you inviting me.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about your story and
Sure.
We'll just go from there.
Sure. So it was, I think, probably about a little bit over 8 years ago. It was in March that I had called my psychiatrist and I had asked her for refills on prescriptions that I was taking. Mm-hmm. And it became clear to her very quickly that I was abusing the medication. And so she had said to me, I want you to go to rehab, not something that I wanted to hear that day. It was probably one of the worst days that I've had and one of the best days because, I was able to talk. I waited for my wife to get home from work and I talked to her about it and she thought it was a great idea for me to go. She saw my behavior deteriorating quite a bit. And so after that, I contacted my daughter and she was very, very supportive of it also. And so within the next couple of days, I had called colleagues and found a rehab a couple of hours away from my home. And so I ended up in rehab. And so I talk about in the book that as the memories or as as the medication was going out of my system, the memories of childhood abuse came back with like a vengeance. And so, I talk about in the book, being like 4 years old and remembering that my dad had forced me to eat carrots. And for whatever reason, at 4 years old, I didn't want to eat the carrots and he pushed me to eat the carrots and I ended up vomiting at the dinner table. And he picked me up and threw me in the garbage and said, stay there, you're a piece of garbage. And so memories like that came up and memories that I had not thought about or that I had really compartmentalized or repressed came up, that I was around 4 years old when the sexual abuse started with my dad. And the sexual abuse went on from about 4 years old to about 7 years old on a regular basis that I was sexually abused by my dad. And I talk about it in more detail in the book, some of the things, some of the strange things that happened with that. And interestingly enough, we had armed robbery at our home when I was 7 years old. And for whatever reason, that like took my dad's attention off of me. And he was focused on that and finding out who had, set up the robbery and how it came about. And so our home really went downhill. It wasn't in good shape before that, but it really, Lisa, went downhill after that. That I talk about in the book, my dad became paranoid. And one of the strange stories that I talk about is that he gave my sister and I forks and knives and spoons and had us dig out a room in the basement where he could put money and valuables. And at the same time, my mom, really, really struggling and really, really suffering, began substance abuse where she became an alcoholic. And so really like, the book is called Finding My Words. And one of the things in rehab is they kept saying to me, we want you to tell your story. And Lisa, to tell you the truth, I couldn't tell it. I didn't have the words, which is very, very common for people who have been abused.
Yes.
I didn't have the emotional wherewithal. I wasn't ready to talk about it. And so the book is a journey of not having the words and not being able to talk about it emotionally, to being able to get the help that I needed, to be able to start talking about some of the things that happened, and as so as a child, I so compartmentalized the things that had happened to be able to cope that it was hard. that I started writing down things that happened. And as I did that, my counselor, Harry Flanagan, had suggested that I type up, the abuse that I suffered on a Word document. And I did that. And as I did that, so many more memories came up.
Yeah.
And so he gently walked me through that over a period of a few years. No, it wasn't quick. And I want to stress that
hmm
I'm about 8.5 years out and still have a lot of trauma symptoms as a result of the complex trauma that I
Yes.
suffered from.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
um, it was something that I can remember sitting in rehab and being like, I am never telling this story to anyone, you know. And as a little child, I can remember times when I said to myself, you know what, I'll never tell any of this to anyone. I just had that message that I got from my dad to never discuss the things that happened.
Yeah. Do you think there was shame involved in that, or do you think that,
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, that's a big one. And that's interesting that you talk about no voice, because I can completely relate to that. I got my voice about 6 or 7 years ago. So I totally understand that there's something to be said about just not sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's both the shame aspect, which was huge. I think you're 100% right with that.
hmm
There was the huge shame aspect. The other thing is I was so young, I didn't know what was happening. I just
hmm
knew that it was very, very disturbing to my body
hmm
and also
hmm
very exciting to my body.
Yeah.
So you
Yep.
have the mixed feelings and
hmm
you feel guilty and you feel shame about.
Confusion.
And plus also there's brain things going on that,
hmm
parts of the brain go offline when you have
hmm
trauma or when you have abuse, so that you're not formulating a vocabulary of the words to be able to talk about those things. So I
Interesting.
think it was, I think, Lisa, for me, it was, and if readers read the book, they'll see just how much trauma I had. I think that it was a perfect storm of just so many things. There
Yeah.
was physical abuse, not a lot of physical abuse, but being thrown in the garbage, that was a huge thing for me.
hmm
And then the sexual abuse
hmm
and the aftermath of that and all the confusion with that,
hmm
there was a lot of emotional abuse, and I would say a lot of covert um, verbal abuse.
mm.
So just sorting through that and
Right.
just be able to kind of be like, I have so much shame that I carry. Like, what's the matter with me that all of these things happen to me? And being able to get the courage to be able to share those. And,
Yeah.
I talk about in the book, the first person I shared things with was Harry Flanagan, a counselor that I had that
hmm
just was so good. And then was able to share things with my wife, Debbie. And then little by little, it, broadened from that where I was able to talk to more people about it, safe people, people
Right.
that people that could hold my story
Right.
without backing away. And people
Yeah.
that, yeah, and people that could hold the story well
hmm
and be able to not push me to talk about more and not,
Right.
said, leave the room, so to speak, leave the room, but
Right.
could be able to stay there with me. And then little by little, I was able to talk with my daughter about it and my son-in-law, Brandon, my daughter and
hmm
son-in-law, Brandon. And then from there, little by little, I started sharing just a little bit more. And as you read the book, a lot of strange things happen. And so,
hmm
sexual abuse, it is so hard to talk about
Yeah.
in with. And then when there's really, not that any of it is not bizarre, but when you have particularly bizarre things happen,
hmm
that you say to yourself, I'll never tell anyone. Really hard to be
Yeah.
able to tell people about,
Yeah.
you
And
know,
I would think well, one of the things that I wanted to have on this platform is the ability to have men on here and share their story, because it's very different than women. We all share with that, the shame and everything, but there's something, especially when it comes to sexual abuse with the men, because men don't feel comfortable with sharing. There's, I would want to say, a different set of kind of shame that men carry than women carry. And men aren't comfortable with coming forward and sharing these details and not feeling like, oh, I'm going to tell them, and then, oh, they're going to think horribly of me. And, on the other side of it, when we're hearing these stories,
Yeah.
our heart, like my heart goes out to you. I just can't imagine that little boy and what he went through. And, but man, shame is just, there is nothing good about shame, is there?
No, and I think that shame, just moves into the story and says, first of all, don't tell anyone because
Yeah.
maybe they believe you, or if they do believe you, they're going to back away. And it's
Mm-hmm.
been really for me. I'm in a church context, and so
Mm-hmm.
that for me, it was really really hard. But I can say that it has been like really really good that people have moved toward me, you
Yeah.
know, and as I've been able to share my story in safe places, the
Mm-hmm.
shame has begun to dissipate more.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about with men, sexual
Mm-hmm.
abuse of men. I think it's one out of every four, approximately. The research says with women, and I think it's one out of every six with men, maybe higher because of lack of reporting.
Yeah.
But like I said, when I started this journey, I was like, I'm not telling anybody anything. It was hard enough admitting it to myself. And then little by little, as I got more healing,
Mm-hmm.
I had different counselors that had said, you have such a strange story, such a hard story. It might be good to write about it, for other
Mm-hmm.
people. And I was like, no way. There's no way, there's no way that I'm going to do that. And then, little by little, as I gained more healing and I was able to share it with more people, there was less of a aversion to do it. Let's say that. And
Right.
then I was at dinner with some friends of ours on a Friday night, people that we get together with regularly. And I was talking to them about some of the things that had happened to me in the sexual abuse and just some of the things that I talk about in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book. And I remember them saying to me, maybe you should write a book. And it was kind of like, maybe I will. There was like that feeling like, maybe that's what I'll do.
Yeah, that
And I wanted,
voice was gone. That shutting you down was gone.
yeah, and I wanted to write it in the context of people in the church because a lot of it is not talked about and it needs to be talked about so that
Yes.
it can be more quote unquote normalized, whatever that means, so that people can talk about, and
Mm-hmm.
in my experience, Lisa, I have had so many people come to me, not only professionally, but just people, that I talk to that have said, you know what, I've never told anybody this,
Mm-hmm.
but I was sexually abused by my
Mm-hmm.
dad or my uncle or whomever. And so that's I wanted to have a ministry and to be able to
Mm-hmm.
help people in counseling, and so a lot of my caseload now is working with people who've had issues with addiction,
Mm-hmm.
issues with mood dysregulation, which is so prevalent with people that have been traumatized, you know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, substance abuse, the abuse, the trauma, and just helping people to get to know their story better
Right.
and to be able to use their story for good.
Right. Right. I was involved in a ministry in my church for 8 years, and it was the Childhood Abuse Healing Workshop. And I
Oh wow, okay.
co-facilitated it with a good friend of mine. Her name's Beverly. And we were handed the workshop. Another lady in the church had created it with God and had spent, I think, 15 years doing workshops. And I had gone through it, and then Beverly had gone through it. And the lady, her name was Karen,
Mhm,
she had decided it was time to retire, and she wanted to
mhm.
hand it off to somebody who could run with it. And she handed it to Beverly and I, and we successfully did it for 8 years. And it was the most amazing 8 years, and watched hundreds of women heal. And the first day of the workshop was every woman telling one quick story. And we did it for a couple of reasons. One, some of them had never shared their story ever. We had a 75-year-old woman who'd never shared her story, not even with her husband of 50 something years. It also expose the lies, right? So they're telling their story, and we're also having them, explain what is going on in your head. What are you thinking? What are you saying to yourself as this is happening? And we write down the lies, because you hear all the lies that come out, the lies that they've
Yeah,
believed, right, from the
yeah,
situation. And then it also created a connection. It created a connection because we had about 12 to 13 women. We didn't have more than that. We wanted to keep it very intimate. It was powerful what that one story would do. And, a lot of times when you speak something out that feels so shameful, all of a sudden it has no power. Don't you find that true? Like, as you've been telling your story, all of a sudden that shame doesn't have as much power over you, right?
absolutely. And I think that that's been my journey,
Mm-hmm.
to formulate the words. And I talk about in the book, like finding my words and then
Mm-hmm.
speaking my words
Mm-hmm.
and then embracing my story, finding good out of the story to be
Right.
able to help other people. And I think that, yeah, I could have never, even if it was like 5 years ago, I could never have talked about the things that I talk about more freely now, and it's a process. I think that that's one of the things that I talk about in the book is,
Mm-hmm.
it's not one and done. It's a
No.
process that, once you move into recovery, for me at least, it's something that it's an everyday process. There's new memories
Mm-hmm.
that come up, there's new flashbacks that
Yeah.
arise, and finding ways to cope with and deal with
Mm-hmm.
those in effective ways. you
Right.
know just the community, for me, the church community has been so positive with,
That's
embracing
wonderful.
me with it, and
Mm-hmm.
being really loving and filled with grace. And it's by
Mm-hmm.
the grace of God that I ended up, with the substance abuse and things like that, being able to heal from those things. And
Right.
so I wanted to write this book to say, I've had, and you've read some of it,
Mm-hmm.
really complex trauma. And
Mm-hmm.
if I could heal from it, anybody can. It
You
just
give
takes,
hope.
yeah, to give hope, because
Mm-hmm.
it takes time and it takes patience and it takes, for me, I really believe it takes community.
Oh
you
yeah.
know um, a lot of the researchers on trauma talk about the fact of, moving into and being integrated into a community. And
Mm-hmm.
I found that, and it has been really good for me,
Mm-hmm.
be
I
able to,
agree.
yeah, to be able to, be open little by little, not
Mm-hmm.
all, but little by little, test the waters. I tell people, test the waters to see, who's gonna be able to embrace your story. And some people will be able to, and some won't, and that's fine.
Right. I think for the most part, people do embrace it, and people are shocked. And when they see you today and they see how you're living your life, I mean, how could you not have hope, right? And it's interesting because it sounds like our background is somewhat similar in that. And I just realized, like, I've put my whole life together in the last year. I've had a healing journey since I was 19, and there's been substantial journey, healing over probably the last 5 to 10 years. But this last year, I actually put the timeline together. And the one thing that I realized, and it sounds like from what you're describing, because my abuse started, I remember back when I was 4 as well. And that's all I know. Like, that was my life. The people that were there to protect me didn't. They didn't protect me from the abuser. And as a matter of fact, they used that against me. And so I didn't have a safe place, right? I didn't have a safe place growing up. No adults, I mean, and some of the adults witnessed the abuse and nobody stopped it. And so the message, having to deconstruct that, right? And having to really come to the absolute belief in my heart. I had been hearing this for years, and I told myself this for years, but it wasn't until recently that I really believed that it wasn't my fault. It really wasn't my fault. I could have been the
You
worst little girl ever, and I didn't deserve
Yeah,
what I got.
and unfortunately, we carry that around in our body, that it
Mm-hmm.
is,
Mm-hmm.
even when we get to the point cognitively where we can say, no, it wasn't our point. There's something in our bodies that say,
Yes.
what did I do
Right. If I would
to
have
bring
just
this
done
on?
this or
Yeah,
didn't do that.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's been important to be able to, like, verbalize things, talk about things, in a very sensitive way in the book, but in a raw way, you know,
Yeah.
And for me to be able to talk about, my faith, how important my faith is,
Mm-hmm.
how it has been instrumental in keeping me going
Yeah.
when I didn't know how I was going to keep going, because, I've had a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression,
Yes.
a lot of the symptoms that go with, complex trauma, and like
Right.
I talked about mood dysregulation and things like that. And my family has been wonderful, which I'm really, really thankful,
Mm-hmm.
because that has been really helpful. My wife Debbie has been so understanding, and my daughter and
Yeah.
my son-in-law Brandon, Emily and Brandon have just been wonderful in supporting me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a hard journey,
It is. And
really hard.
for me, and correct me if you believe differently, I don't think you ever heal completely, because it takes you in a different direction, right? So you're never going to be back to where you were before the abuse started. I do believe we're really strong, right? Because look at where we're at today. We couldn't have gotten through this without strength, right? But I feel like you're always kind of managing it, kind of tweaking it, and that's okay. You know, when you get to the point where you can kind of manage it. But like I just had a trigger 2 weeks ago. I had a trigger, and I full on, I realized I was being triggered, but there was such clarity that I actually looked over at my husband, and I looked at him, I said, I am clearly being triggered because everything going through my head makes no sense whatsoever. And I am being completely irrational, and it was just calling it out. And he's that safe place. Like you said, your wife, having that safe place where you can say this crazy stuff where while I'm saying it, I felt stupid, right? I felt like, oh, get it
Mhm.
together, but I was being triggered.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
realized it, and I was able to get myself calmed down and think rationally, because I would just go, I can't think that way because that's irrational. I need to think a different way. But
yeah.
that
And
is
and
huge.
it, yeah, I talk a lot in the book about the past is not the past when it shows up in the present, and
Yeah.
so I talked about in the book and talk about triggers, that idea of me, eating the carrots, vomiting, and being thrown in the
Hmm.
garbage, and then fast forward, I'm 28 years old, and I go to a wedding, and I'm sitting there with my wife, and there's steak and there's potatoes and there's carrots, and I don't even think about it, and I take a bite, and it
Dear.
really, talk about the book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
I take a bite of the carrots and I immediately gag. I didn't make the connection,
Hmm.
but my body did.
Hmm.
Another one, Lisa, I talk about is when when I was growing up, when my dad would come home, the garage door would go up, and I'd hear the garage door go up, and
Hmm.
my body would just tense,
Hmm.
it just tighten, and I would be triggered, And so fast forward, Debbie and I get married, and we move into a house with automatic garage doors. And so Debbie comes home from teaching, and the garage door goes up, and I didn't know then. I had no idea, but my body just froze.
Hmm.
And so that idea that, sometimes people will say things like, oh, the past is the past, but it's just not true. The past is not the past when it shows up in the present. And
Yeah.
for people that have gone through abuse, or people that have had trauma, there are a lot of triggers that
Hmm.
they live with. And I would say to you that, weekly I'm triggered by different things that happen. And
Hmm.
at least now, you talk about having somebody safe to talk to, and I have a
Hmm.
group of people that I could talk to, and that feels really safe to me.
Hmm.
And they don't look at me like I have three heads. I feel like I do sometimes with some of them, but it just helps me to be able to process and to regulate and to get more balanced. Because
Right.
it feels like sometimes it feels like the trauma of whenever it was shows up today, and it feels like it's happening today.
It's so bizarre because it completely feels like that moment. Like when I was being triggered, I mean, for me, I think the first thing you need in order to really begin your healing is self-awareness, right? Because self-awareness is what kind of opens a door and makes you realize a lot of things. And when I realized I was being triggered, and I looked over at my husband and I said that, I scanned my body. I scanned, to see what was going on with it. And it I knew why I was being triggered. Once I realized I was being triggered, I knew exactly what caused it. And I felt exactly that same way I did that moment 40 years ago or whatever it was that caused that trigger. And I had all those emotions in my body, had all those feelings. And I just had, as soon as I said it, I said, I'm being triggered clearly because this is irrational what I'm thinking and what I'm saying. It's crazy. He just smiled at me, and then I could breathe and get myself calmed down and say, okay, we're going to go do whatever it was we were going to go do. And I was fine.
Yeah, there's such the research indicates, and I've seen it in my own life, there's such a disconnect in your body, between your brain and your
Yes.
body. And the other thing is, for me, in my story, wanting to cut off what I'm feeling.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and so that's been an ongoing challenge for me to feel my
Mm-hmm.
feelings,
Mm-hmm.
because at a young age, I learned to cut them off.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
that's a challenge for me. But, like you talked about, it's a process, it's ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
It's on this side of heaven. There's no, a one and done that you're going to be healed.
No.
It's ongoing healing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a great journey, but it's a tough journey. And I don't want to minimize that, but it's definitely worthwhile.
And as you begin your healing, and I call it, like, one of the things I feel as my healing grows is freedom. There's just freedom, and there's just
Absolutely.
like a freedom within me, and just a really good space. And that for me is what motivates me to continue to grow and to heal. Because one of the things that us childhood abuse survivors have to deal with is kind of cleaning up the mess that we've done over the years when we were living in our survival mode, or when we were in that place, right? And we hurt a lot of people, and we said things and we did things, and I still catch myself cringing, you know. But we do need to forgive ourselves, and that's part of the healing process.
Absolutely. And I think that, I talk about it in the book, just like a lot of brokenness that I had, a lot of maladaptive behaviors, a lot of sexual brokenness. And I talk, for me, like I said, my faith is really important, to be
Mm-hmm.
able to have the grace that I receive from God, to
Mm-hmm.
be able to move forward, and to
Mm-hmm.
be able to realize that, you talked about awareness. When you are so traumatized, you don't have a lot of awareness. And
Right.
so as you begin recovery, awareness is a key
Yep.
to be able to change behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so, realizing that, if I would have known better, I would have done better. But,
Right.
I talk about that simple thing,
Yeah.
hurt people, and it's really
Yeah.
true.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Rohr says that if we don't transform our pain, we transmit it.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah,
We don't transform it, we transmit it.
uh,
Ooh, that's true.
that's just the nature of the beast. And
Mm-hmm.
so being able to step back and say, even today, I'm not where I want to be, but I'm not where I was 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is something that I remind people when they're in their growing, and when they're in their healing, and they get discouraged and they get frustrated. It's like, think back. Where were you a year ago? Where were you 5 years ago? Where were you 10 years ago? If you can see growth, you're on the right path. Like you said, it's not one and done, and it's not like, oh, this magical thing is going to fix it. It is a process. This stuff happened to us when we were children in our little brains. I mean, as adults, we can't rationalize it, right? Right here as an adult, I can't rationalize hurting a child. How can a child rationalize that? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so for me, part of my journey, and I talk about it in the book, and it has continued, is just having the privilege of having so much professional care,
Yes.
treatment, and being able to meet with people who can see things and have walked the path before me,
Mm-hmm.
so can help me with that. So, I talk about in the book going to rehab, and then getting out of rehab and having individual counseling,
Mm-hmm.
and then going for IOP, intensive outpatient counseling.
Okay.
Did that for about a year, three times a week, and then went into counseling with, and did a lot of the trauma work then with Harry Flanagan with Pure
Mm-hmm.
Desire Ministries. And then, you know, still meet with him off and on, but also have done some other things with narrative therapy or story work. And that's been
Mm-hmm.
really, really powerful for me to get to know my story better,
Mm-hmm.
for me to understand more clearly family of origin work, and
Mm,
what really was going on in my family to the best of the ability of the counselor and myself. And,
mm-hmm.
then moving into doing some brain spotting and a technique that's really, really helpful for
Mm.
people. I'd ask people to kind of look that up, if they're suffering from flashbacks and
Oh,
dysregulation in their bodies. Um, and then I've just stepped into doing some work with internal family systems. Just another technique that is helpful for people to get to know the different parts of themselves.
mm-hmm.
I think that there's a certain amount of fragmentation that happens when people go and are abused,
Yeah, I agree.
and so it's a
That's
way
a
to
good word. That's a good word. That's a good
yeah,
way to put it.
yeah. And I think that so it's a matter of then going back and just realizing, that you couldn't cope with a lot of the things when you were little, and so you have
Yeah.
different maladaptive coping, but was uh, really good coping back then because it helped you survive.
Right. Right. But then you carry it into your adult life and it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, not so good after.
Not so good after a while. Yeah. You kind of make a mess of
Absolutely,
things. That's so
absolutely.
true.
So it's a matter of, for me, it's a matter of having, professionals that I could work with, and also very
Hmm.
safe individuals. Friends are really important to me that I can talk to about my journey. You know, um, just contacting people and asking them to pray for me.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's really, really important to me, and
Hmm.
I emphasize in the book my spiritual walk, and that's been really, really instrumental for me in
Hmm.
my
Me too.
healing.
Hmm.
Yeah, in my healing, to be able to, just accept the grace of God
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. Cause there's so much that we just, there's going to be so many unanswered questions,
Hmm.
and you're not going to get the answers. And I'm with you because, me and God, we've had a tight relationship literally as far back as I can remember. I don't remember a time that he wasn't in there in my life. And it is what helped me get through so much of this. Because when I was feeling all alone and I was all alone, I wasn't all alone.
Yeah. So I would just encourage listeners to keep in mind that this is, it's a process. It's not a procedure. It
Right.
takes it takes time, and you can't rush it. The healing, things that I am doing now, I could have never done, 7 years ago,
Right.
or things that I did, a few years after being in recovery, I could have never
Hmm.
done in the beginning. So it's kind of like a process to continue to heal and to move forward.
Yes. Yes. And help others.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part
Right.
of it. Yeah, it's absolutely a big part of it for me. That's my mission is, you know, um, really, really feel, led to help other people in
Hmm.
the in their struggles,
Hmm.
to come alongside them with a lot of the grace and the mercy and the things that I've received.
Right.
Um, so that's an exciting part of it for me. I wanted to write the book and see where things went from there. And this is where it's taken me to podcasts and speaking and
Hmm.
writing articles and doing things like that.
You definitely need to get your voice out there more and encourage more men to get out there and get their voice out there and, disempower this whole shameful thing that
Mhm.
all of us are carrying, right? All of us childhood abuse survivors are carrying. Um, it's not as much in me, but it shows up. It still shows up. That shame still tries to pop up here and there. Like when I had my trigger a couple of weeks
Yeah,
ago,
yeah,
that shame was right there. It's like, really, it's still there. Yeah, really, it's still there.
absolutely. Yeah, I,
Hmm.
I talk about it in the book. People have said to me like, "Well, now that you're like recovered, how you doing?" I'm like, "No, no, no, I'm not recovered. I am recovering." And I make
Recovering.
that clear that it's a day-to-day walk.
Right. And we've carried this stuff for a long time. I mean, I don't know for you. I mean, you said you didn't share anything, but for me, the help it just wasn't there. Now, fortunately, there is a lot of good help. There's a lot of good therapy out there. There's, new therapy that's coming out all the time. For me, what's really helped me is EMDR. That's really helped me as well, too. And that's been really interesting. And I've been doing that pretty intensely for over a year now. And it's been really, I think that's along with me digging in deep and wanting to heal even more and having great tools. is what's really helped exacerbate my healing in the last year.
Yeah, and I think that just the trauma field has so opened up.
Hmm. Thank
Things weren't
goodness.
when I first trained at NYU, it wasn't talked about, you
Mm,
know, it just wasn't evolved enough, and now it is, and it's an exciting field with all
hmm.
of the things, whether you talk about, EMDR, whether you talk about internal family systems or brain spotting, or,
Hmm.
just all of the different trauma techniques that are out there, that a lot of groundbreaking stuff with the body, you know,
Right, right. I
helping
mean,
the
because
body to process.
right, because that's what we're just finding out really, truly is how much of this trauma is stored in our body.
Yeah,
I find that so fascinating, and it is so true because I'm telling you, I am 100% a believer in that. Yes, I never thought I had anxiety. I realized I do have anxiety. Of course, I have anxiety. Why wouldn't I have anxiety?
absolutely. Yeah.
You know. So, well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your book. I would highly recommend that everybody read it. I love that you're very honest and open about it, and yeah, I think it's awesome. And we need more men getting out there and sharing their stories.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate being on.
Okay. And so why don't you also tell us where people can reach you in case they want to get in touch with you?
Sure, they can go to my website, which is just Google Mark McNear, MarkMcnear.com, and they can go to my website, and there's a contact area there where they can email me, and I will get back to them.
Great. And we'll have all that also, all your contact information as well on the podcast. So thank you again. And maybe I'll have you back again in the future.
That'd be a pleasure. Thank you.